Let me know when we're ready, Paul.
I went ahead and started the live stream, and I just got waiting on confirmation that it started.
I'm wanting to do it for myself. Is that okay?
Yeah. So I started on Monday, right?
Uh-huh.
So I started on Monday, right?
Right.
Paul, you doing okay?
Yeah. Again, I'm just waiting on confirmation that the live streaming. It started. So we should be good to go to Mike.
Thank you, Paul. Good afternoon. I'm Mike Rodriguez, the Secretary at the Delaware Department of Education, and I have the pleasure of welcoming you to the third meeting of the Delaware COVID-19 Health and Wellness Working Group. This June 16, 2020 meeting is being called to order at 5 p.m. This meeting is being held electronically. On March 12, 2020, Governor Carney issued a declaration of a state of emergency for the state of Delaware due to a public health threat. The state of emergency allows all public meetings of executive branch public bodies, including the Delaware COVID-19 Health and Wellness Reopening Work Group, to be conducted electronically, either by means of telephone conference call or video conference call. The information regarding this meeting, including information on how to access the public electronically, the meeting electronically was published on June 9, 2020 on the state public meeting calendar site. Individuals may participate in this meeting via the DOE YouTube channel publicized on the agenda. These meetings are public meetings to provide transparency and the opportunity for the public to engage in the process. In order to enable every participant to have voice, public comment will be accepted via email at reopeningideas@do.k12.de.us or via voicemail at 302-735-4244. All comments and ideas will be forwarded to the respective work groups for review and posted on DOE's website as well. Each week, public comment is compiled from the previous week and posted online. A copy is also provided to the work group chairs to then share overall themes related to responses that may impact the work at hand. We encourage working group members to review these comments online before each meeting. To summarize public comment this week, the public comment included a great deal of reopening schools feedback and resources from many of our school nurses. The resources that were shared can help our committee as we continue to refine the essential actions and protocols. We want to thank this group for their continued involvement, resources, and feedback. Next slide, Dan. Paul. So here's tonight's agenda. This week, we made slight adjustments in an effort to maximize the committee's time and our welcome. We will start off with a quick roll call to memorialize who is here this evening. Next, we will provide a recap of the assignment. Then we will take a deep dive into scenario 2, where we talk about minimal to moderate spread. Last week, we reviewed mental health and one of the 6 protocols we were scheduled to discuss. So tonight, we're scheduled to get through 9 protocols. We will close the evenings with a recap of next week's assignment, which should be scenario 3. Next slide, Paul. Again, I am Mike Rodriguez. I'm one of the co-chairs of this committee, along with Dr. Megan Walls, with the assistance from our Opportunity Lab partner, Dr. Mario Ramirez. We would all like to welcome the committee to our 3rd Health and Wellness Committee meeting. In an effort to maximize our time this evening, we would like to take roll call of all the members in attendance. When your name is called, please respond with here or present. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you, Mike.
Mike Rodriguez.
Mike Rodriguez.
Present.
Megan Walls.
Megan Walls.
Kevin Fitzgerald.
Kevin Fitzgerald. Present.
Laretha Duboson.
Duboson.
Susan Haberstroh.
Susan Haberstroh.
Here.
Stacey Greenlee.
Stacey Greenlee.
Present.
Dana Parr.
Dana Parr.
Moving forward, Sue Smith.
Moving forward, Sue Smith.
Sue Smith present.
Sue Smith present.
Emma LaBrower,
LaBrower,
Present.
Daphne Conright,
Conright,
Present.
Maricel Santiago,
Maricel Santiago,
Purvi Powell,
Kirby Powell,
Present.
Valerie Longhurst,
Valerie Longhurst,
Present.
Michael Smith,
Michael Smith,
Present.
Anthony Del Colo,
Anthony Del Colo,
Present.
Laura Sturgeon,
Laura Sturgeon,
Here.
Kristen Dwyer,
Kristen Dwyer,
Present.
Mario Ramirez.
Present.
Thank you. Can we just confirm Dana Carr? No. And Maricel Santiago? No. Thank you.
Thank you, Jackie.
I'm here.
You are. Thank you, Maricel. I'm sorry. Thank you.
And Dana's online also.
Dana, are you online?
I
Dana?
am.
Yeah.
Hello, I'm unable to unmute.
Okay. I hear you. Thank you. Thank you, Mike.
You can, yay, okay.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Jackie.
You're welcome.
Next slide. Great. So public comment is welcome. Please email all public comment at reopeningideas@doe.k12.be.us or by voicemail at 302-735-4244. All the comments will be posted on DOE's reopening page. The link is there provided for your convenience. And for the public, all the materials tonight that were shared with the committee are also on the public meeting site, the Delaware Public Meeting website, and the link is there for your convenience. Next slide.
So just to, again, recap assignments, we started out with our background of our group. The first time we met as a work group, we discussed scenario 1, and last week we began scenario 2. As you can see here, we're going to carry over and continue that discussion from scenario 2 this evening. We understand that we have a lot to get through, so we will do our very best. And then the plan next week is to move on to scenario 3. We want to just, again, as you can tell from the timeline, it is a tight turnover. Our work group members were provided the PowerPoints and information in advance to think about some of the things we'll speak about today. And we will, again, try to move through this, get as much as we can of this scenario 2 done today.
Next slide, Paul. Thanks, Megan. So in an effort to keep us focused and informed, as we begin tonight, I think it's really important to note that the governor, in conjunction with DPH, will make the final decision on whether schools open. The governor, in conjunction with DPH, will make the final decision on how schools open. That means that they will decide which protocols, if any, are required. Our job as a committee is to provide the secretary with recommended guidance that we think is both feasible for schools and protects the health and safety of staff and students. In reflecting on the work thus far, we have been handed a very difficult charge. Each of the public health and wellness scenarios on this roadmap is filled with information that requires time to digest. We also have the varying opinions of all the stakeholder groups each of you represent. As a result, we've been engaged in excellent conversation. However, we were unable to get through 5 or 6 protocols last week, and we need to work as efficiently as possible during today's meeting in order to achieve our established goal. In the weekly email to the committee, we ask committee members to please be prepared with specific language that you feel needs to be added or removed from the existing protocols. We have educators and staff, students and families relying on us to make recommendations that maintain health, wellness, and safety as our main focus. Tonight, it will be important that we get through the protocols in scenario 2 so that we get the feedback necessary to Delawareize this document. Let's keep our focus in mind as we start tonight's work. A few norms that will help us get there is everyone has voice. Please respect all opinions. Let's stay focused on our goal through the lens of health and wellness. Please be succinct, and compromises may be necessary. Next slide.
Thanks, Mike. So the first thing we're going to do briefly tonight, and I say briefly, scenario 1 and 2 have been revised based on work group and community feedback. We're set both the revisions for scenario 1 and 2, but tonight we're just asking if there's anything else from scenario 1. So the scenario 2 revisions draft we will discuss after we finish all of scenario 2. But for tonight, we're just looking for any further additions to scenario 1. We spoke about last week. And thank you very much to the folks who sent in a few just minor changes that they wanted added in writing as well. Those will be reflected. But we wanted to give folks just about 5 minutes if there was anything else in scenario 1 that they still feel is missing. And Paul, I'll look over to see if anyone's raising their hand. Larissa, go ahead.
Yeah, so I think for scenario 1, and I guess this would carry over to scenario 2 since the mental health sections are similar, I would recommend adding some language around having a responsive class or a safe space for students who have experienced trauma due to COVID-19. So I'll share some suggested language. It might be a little lengthy, but I would say it is recommended that schools establish a routine safe space or responsive class designed to support students who have experienced significant trauma in addition to the pandemic and or students who are struggling to cope with the trauma associated with the pandemic.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for being specific. That's so helpful to us. If you want to send that to Mike and I in an email so we can make sure we get those words exactly right, that would be awesome. I took some notes on that though. Again, thank you for being so specific. That's so helpful.
Absolutely.
Reverend Pat, I think you're up next.
Yeah, I'll be succinct. This is over from scenario 1 and 2 under where it says when schools are open and operated. It says encourage schools to implement a mental health screening for all students. The word encourage, I think I would hope that we use some stronger language, but if that's the best language, we can kind of encourage, I guess, the schools to make sure that we implement this mental health. And then the language underneath it under scenario 1, it says discuss and determine the relevant mental and emotional health assessments. That language did not carry over to scenario 2 under that same category. So maybe we just have to copy that and put that under scenario 2 under that same category.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for pointing that one out. I wrote both of those things down. Anything else for scenario 1? And if not, we're going to move forward. Oh, sorry about that. Sue Smith, go ahead.
Hi, I just want to add that maybe we need to also add some specific wording with grief counseling because we have so many students that have experienced and staff that have experienced loss during this time, which is really an issue right now with loss of family members to COVID.
Thanks. That's a really good point here. We need to be careful about how we're responding and making sure we're covering everything. Okay, I don't see any more hand raises on here, so I think we're going to move along. Paul, you want to move to the next slide? And Mario, I'm going to hand it to you just to quickly review scenario 2 and talk a bit about some of the signs.
And Mario, before you start,
Go ahead.
Before you start, we did receive some committee feedback that we received after we sent the email to the committee. Please be rest assured that we will incorporate and integrate that feedback after tonight's meeting and whatever other feedback we receive this evening. Sorry, Mario.
No problem, Michael. So just to recap this scenario, we're going to be talking about that situation where we have really kind of a medium amount of spread of the virus in the community. This is sort of present day, if you will. And in this instance, we're talking about a basic reproductive number that's sort of close to 1. So we think that for the foreseeable future that we can expect a certain amount of circulating disease, and that corresponds to phase 1 and 2 of the Delaware reopening roadmap. And before we jump into this, Megan asked if I might just quickly go over some of the studies that have come out in the last few days. And one of the pieces of feedback that we got that Michael referenced in the last 24 hours was some question about what sort of updated data around pediatric susceptibility to the disease is. So for folks who are News watchers, the Washington Post has a report today saying that kids only appear to be about half as susceptible to infection from COVID, and that's from a journal called Nature Medicine, which is, in my opinion, a pretty well-regarded journal. And they used a series of mathematical models to show that kids are about half as susceptible as adults. Now, the problem, though, is that at the same time that study came out, there were two other journal articles that came out, one in the Lancet and one in the Journal of Pediatrics, both out of China or using Chinese data, but both showing that kids were just as susceptible and infected at rates that were just as high as adults. So, my interpretation of those data is that, we still don't have a clear sense for how susceptible kids are and how likely they are to pass on the disease. So if that's helpful, it may be worth kind of evaluating these protocols in that context. So, Michael?
Thank you. Next slide. So I stated earlier, we have 9 protocols to get through this evening, and we're going to begin with screening students. Next slide. So the screening students protocol has 3 slides to it. So what I've asked Paul to do is to leave the first slide up for a few seconds, pop up the second slide for a few seconds, and then the third slide, and then we'll discuss the entire protocol as a whole. Thanks, Paul. So in this protocol, the CDC basically recommends a temperature screening of students upon entry only if feasible. And then what they do is they recommend a protocol if it is feasible. What's the committee's feeling on the guidance that's been provided? Are there any tweaks that need to be made? Anything that needs to be removed or added? The first 2 bullets basically, first 3 bullets are about access to the school building, limiting parents and other adults entering the building. Bullets 5 and 6 are about parents sharing the responsibility of monitoring symptoms and doing some temperature checks prior to the student even leaving the house. Are there any additions? Anything needs to be tweaked?
Just a reminder to make sure you raise your hand if you, okay. Sue Smith, go ahead.
Sorry. A couple of things we have in there that parents are required, and we had changed it to should. And I can't see if it's on your slide or not, but on my slide that I printed out, it had required to. The other question was about, we had changed in scenario 1, it's 99.5, and scenario 2, it's 100.4 for a temperature. There's a concern about the 100.4 because so many people see 104 and not 100.4 in the general population. So we've seen that as a struggle with nurses, that we generally use the temperature of 100 for students to go home. And there is a great concern about that 100.4 being confusing to families. The other scenario is we're concerned that parents are going to want us to do the temperature checks on students coming in, which is going to kind of be difficult, but it's a tangible assessment of a child, which we feel like that there would be more support for that for our families. So we're kind of on the fence with that one.
Thank you. Just to be clear in terms of, what you are suggesting, do you think changing that to 99.5 would be the consistent and correct thing to do?
Well, it depends on who you're looking. CDC and NASA are 100.4. Our concern is that 100.4 compared to parents thinking 104 and waiting for their child's temperature to be 104 and not 100.4. So I think it's public health, CDC, what the recommendation should be. If it's 99.5, we do an assessment of a child in the school setting. If it's 100 and stays there, we generally send them home.
Thanks. Mario, I'll go to you quickly. I'm not sure if you had a comment specifically on the temperature. Mario, if you're talking, you're muted.
Thanks, Megan. So I would say this has come up in a couple of other places, and I would say from the medical side that I would recommend consistency with CDC rather than setting our own sort of floor. The other problem, right, is that if you lower your temperature, you're going to increase the sort of capture or the sensitivity so much that you're going to sort of screen students out who are in fact not sick. And so, to the extent that we're trying to get kids back to school, that's something worth considering.
Thanks. Okay. Sue, I'm going to note this. I would request that maybe as school nurses, you have some more thought around a specific rec that we can write in here that is distinct so that we can make sure we're actually having, to your point, a consistent thing that we're recommending. I think, Larissa, you were next.
Actually, that was going to be my comment as well around the parents being required versus should.
Okay. Reverend Howell.
My hand is not up. I'm sorry.
So Megan,
Go ahead, Mike.
Megan, before we go on, when we're talking about the required versus should, what's the recommendation from the two that brought that up? I just wasn't sure. Are we saying it should be should in scenario 2 or it should be required in scenario 2?
I can speak to that. My comment was going to just be around the feasibility of parents actually doing it. I think it would be great if all of them could, but a number of families just won't be able to because of their own work schedules. So I think that's why we get into the language of should versus required, because it's not a feasible expectation.
Thank you.
Thank you. The next hand up.
Hi, I just wanted to see if we could put some clarification in there about non-medicated temperature, because we do have families who, students who don't feel well and explain that they were given Tylenol or ibuprofen before they were sent to school, and then the fever spikes later.
Thank you, Stacy.
Sue Smith, did you have your hand back up, or is that from before?
I do. Thank you, Stacy. That's also on my list of things because that is a big problem with parents medicating their children before they come to school. I think the issue with in our school settings, the difficulty of being able to, if we bring all of the students in, the difficulty of being able to assess students' temperatures in a timely manner, but also for parents, the availability of thermometers. So this temperature taking is really a fine line of who should and who could and recommendations. So I think that's going to be building specific, but if one building does it, then parents are going to want it everywhere. And if one district's doing it, then they're going to want it in other districts. So this is quite a conversation for temperature taking. Just wanted to share that.
Thank you, Sue.
Any other thoughts on specifically the screening students piece? I don't see any more hands, Mike, but I just wanted to double check.
Thank you, everyone.
All right, we can go to the next slide, Paul, and there are two of these slides that also go together. So we'll do this in the same fashion. We'll have folks look over, if you can kind of flip back and forth between those two for a couple of seconds. Certainly, if you have questions already or thoughts, you can raise your hands. But this is on our testing for students and responding to positive cases, again, based on CDC recommendations. And as you can see, that's a long paragraph up there, but basically says that right now the CDC is not asking schools to do the testing, and that at some point there might be point of care testing that's easy and makes this more feasible. But at this point, CDC is not saying that schools are recommending testing. And again, there's 2 slides for this, so open to comments, things we're missing, things we need to change here. Or also, you know, what folks' thoughts are on sort of following CDC guidelines here and not having schools test at all. All right, I see one. Sue, go ahead.
Sorry, I really don't mean to dominate, but I do have like points because it seems to be the nurse's line. The issue with students being ill at school goes back to the screening and to this one and to all with our students that are ill and sending them being transported home is we really need a recommendation that admin and districts have a backup plan to get students home, because during this time, and this is, you know, we have students that will rest in our offices for 3 or 4 hours till a parent can come get them. And during this time, we really can't have that. So we really need a recommendation that districts have a backup plan to help get students home when they are ill.
Thank you. Mario, I see your hand.
Yeah, I was just going to note, I know that this slide has the same language about requiring, and I just wanted to let folks know that that language has already been changed. I think we're using the same slides prior to the revisions from last night where all of that language was changed to should. So all of those sort of comments about parents are required, that has all been updated and changed to should language.
Good.
Thanks, Mario. Paul, if you want to pull that next slide too, that is also a testing and responding slide. There you go. In case anyone doesn't have that in front of them, that's the second slide of this. So any other thoughts, comments? I see again the temperature piece. So again, I think, you know, we need to have a solid recommendation on that. I'll give it one more minute in case anyone else has thoughts about this particularly, and then we'll move on. Laura, go ahead.
Okay. So since it looks like the recommendation is like not to test broadly, but rather only test if a student has symptoms, is exhibiting symptoms, I just wanted to point out, maybe it's obvious, but we should make sure that parents and guardians have all the information they need about testing sites and free testing and, you know, how to get a test quickly, because if they're going to keep a student home just for maybe having some congestion, we're going to want to get those kids tested quickly, so in case it is just, you know, allergies or, you know, a benign cold, and we want them to be able to come back to school, but they really should stay home until they get the results of their test. So having parents aware of exactly where they can go, when they can go quickly to get a test is going to be very important.
So Laura, you know, in thinking about how that looks as a formal recommendation, you know, should we put something there like schools should partner with PhD among whomever's doing the more public testing at the time, and medical systems to provide accurate testing information each week, something like that.
Yeah, I would do that. If it's not anywhere else, we should definitely put it here because, you know, we're putting a lot of burden on the parents, which, you know, should be, and unless our wellness centers are going to be able to do tests, I don't know if that's something we've considered. But if they're not, then yeah, parents need to know where they can get tests. The more kids we have tested, you know, the less risk that a positive child is infecting others. So yeah, I would somewhere in there include that information. What you said, the recommendation that they partner.
That's a really great recommendation. Okay, Daphne, go ahead.
Thanks. I think along with that, maybe we can make sure that parents have information about what symptoms to be on the lookout for, so they have accurate and the same information across the state.
Great point. And I think we talked about a little bit about making sure we're streamlining parent information and communication in the last two things, but I think we probably need to put that in here again. And we also added in last time working with partners. So, you know, I know, for example, Nemours updates our pediatric symptom list and those kinds of things frequently. So that's a great point too. Anyone else on this testing for students and responding to positive cases before we move on? Okay, Mike, I will hand it back over to you. And Sue has one more comment, sorry.
Just to let you all know, there is a letter from Public Health and DOE that was sent out today to the lead school nurses to be shared with all of the nurses. That will be a letter that will be sent home to parents about signs and symptoms to look for and about should check temperatures and all. So we are pretty proactive on that one. So hopefully that'll be helpful.
Excellent. And Daphne, it sounds like I think Daphne has one more comment.
No, I'm okay. It's okay. Thanks.
All right, Mike, I will hand it back to you, and Paul, you can go to that next slide.
Thank you. The next slide is responding to positive tests among staff and students. It's only one slide. And basically it says if there's a positive test among staff or student, that the classroom will be closed immediately for cleaning, and it won't reopen until it's clean. And in general, if the person or a student was in multiple areas, that it might cause multiple areas of the school to be closed. Any thoughts, tweaks, changes?
Daphne, is that a comment that you have? I saw your name twice on here, so I'm not sure if it was from before or not.
Yes, I'm kind of wondering where this should go, so I don't know if this should go here, but I'm thinking about something that the CDC also recommends is to offer options in regards to for students and staff. And so responding to positive cases and also encouraging people to stay home when they're sick. Do we have any guidance in here around attendance policies or absenteeism and things like that districts should really consider and look at their policies during this time so that people aren't encouraged to send to school so they won't miss, more than 3 days or whatever their current policies are.
That's important.
Great recommendation. Absolutely.
Thanks. Christian's the next hand raised.
I just want to echo that sentiment made by Daphne earlier. I think in the first meeting, or maybe it was the second meeting, I talked about the department needing to define some of their language. For instance, time was one that I'm still waiting for a good definition on. I think that, there are going to be some regulations and possibly even some statutes that will have to be re-looked at in order to accommodate students, teachers, and parents at this time. And what Daphne raised is something districts will need, and it can't be a district by district decision in all cases. And that's just one example of that. So I just want to make sure that DOE, I'm sure you are well aware of what is a local decision, isn't a local decision.
I will bring that to leadership, and we will have a discussion on that, Kristen. Thank you.
Daphne?
Sorry, I forgot to lower my hand.
Okay. Any other thoughts around this piece? Like, I'm just trying to see if there's any more hand raised. Okay, I'm going to cautiously move on. You can go to the next slide, Paul. So the next piece here, this has, I think there's 4 slides, or 3 slides of dining and extracurriculars. So again, Paul, if you want to slowly kind of move between those, I'll just give everyone a minute to look over those 3 slides. But certainly as things come up, feel free to raise your hand. Larissa, go ahead.
This is just a clarifying point that might be a point of confusion for schools. On the second slide, it references assemblies of less than 50 being allowed. I'm assuming that doesn't apply to dining room. Should I repeat?
Yeah, you were a little bit cutting out a little bit there.
Okay, I was just saying that the second slide refers to assemblies of less than 50 being allowed. I'm assuming that's not referring to dining spaces because students can't keep their facial coverings on and eat at the same time. That might just need to be clarified.
That's a great question.
Mario, maybe clarify how that's written.
Yeah, when that was originally written, it was intended to say that like groups of more than 50 shouldn't be allowed at all, even in eating spaces. But there's certainly other states that have said that they're going to allow folks to eat in cafeterias, provided that folks are 6 feet apart or only seating on one side of the table. That's something that should be adjudicated here for sure.
Thank you.
Does anyone have thoughts on that? Please, can you guys try to mute yourself if you're not getting some feedback again? Anyone have comments on that sort of the 50, assemblies of less than 50 students at a time, or the large scale assemblies of more? Any comments on those things? Stacey?
I think for schools, in the schools I've worked, they have been at capacity. It's going to be, several of these things are going to be really difficult decisions for schools to make. They would have to, in my school, we already have three lunches. We may need to have 6 lunches, like there, to space students out. It's just going to be difficult decisions for schools to make, in addition to if they had to close a classroom because a teacher or student came down with the virus. There are no spare classrooms to open up and move that class to. So these are just going to be difficult decisions for schools to make. I'm not saying they can't make them. I just wanted to point that out because most schools in Delaware are at capacity or over.
Thanks, Stacey. Representative Smith, go ahead.
Thanks, Megan. I was just going to say, I think it should be consistent with what the guidelines would be overall for indoor and outdoor capacities for just, again, for consistency purposes, make sure parents are on the same page, teachers are on the same page. I think that's been one of the confusing parts for people. They have to think through different things for depending on where they go.
Just to clarify, are you saying in line with Delaware's current guidelines?
Correct.
Okay. Thank you. That's really helpful. Sue Smith?
Thank you. Suggestions of, like, in the cafeteria, when they talk about one-sided table, suggestions were made that other areas in the school setting that aren't in use, like the gym or the hallway or large entryways to set up for students for eating, maybe a suggestion for some of the schools. And then the other concern was if they do go back to the cafeterias, a lot of our schools have the student entry for identifying that the student's getting lunch, that they put their number in. A suggestion was that maybe the cafeteria personnel would be the one that would put the number in instead of the student for cleanliness. One of the biggest concerns everybody keeps talking about is how are we going to clean, have the capacity to do the cleaning that we need to do, and those kinds of things. And that would be with going in the cafeteria or the classrooms, even going to for breakfast and lunch in the classrooms, custodians going to pick up that trash after the meals and all. There's just a lot with not a lot of manpower or woman power, staff power.
Hey, Mama.
Thanks, Sue. I think that's important. Do you have, Sue, speaking to that, you're saying you're concerned about some of these cleaning. Are there any specific points or recommendations that you think we need to add in here to address that, whether that's, you're saying we don't have the manpower, do we have to have extra janitorial hours, or, are you saying that you think we need to keep kids in classrooms to eat because that's where we can manage that cleaning? Give me some ideas of what are some recommendations we can actually push into this document.
A couple recommendations that I received were if district could hire a couple extra custodial staff that could float between buildings where the high needs are. And then if a custodian was absent, you would already have somebody that's trained to know what to do, because it's not always easy to get substitute custodial staff. So there may need to be an increase in staffing. The eating in the eating in the classrooms, the concern is that would be duty-free time at lunch for teachers. So that's a concern with teachers for that duty-free time. So it's kind of a little controversy, but I hear mostly from parents and nurses and families is that, how are we going to get the cleaning done? And about how kids are going to wear masks. So those seem to be the two hot topics.
Thanks, Sue. I appreciate that. Emma, we're going to go to you next.
Kind of going off of what Sue said, one of the things I thought of in terms of the cafeteria was the keypads that you enter your number in to buy your lunch, but also, especially in my high school years, there were things such as microwaves provided for the kids who did pack their lunch that everybody touched. That always made me nervous even prior to COVID. And I'm just thinking of all of the things in the cafeteria that we touch, such as water dispensers, the keypads, the microwaves. And I think there would have to be either you couldn't use the microwave or extra cleaning after lunch.
That's a great point for some of those, thinking about some of those communal things. Daphne, go ahead.
Just a comment about the lunchroom. Parents have long, I just want everybody to be aware that adding extra lunches may mean that we either need to find other spaces for kids to eat lunch, or kids will be eating lunch at 9 a.m. and 2 p.m. And parents have long had concerns about, in order to be ready for learning, my kid cannot be hungry. And so if you try to make extra lunches amongst a bunch of other concerns to make that happen, we need to not forget that kids can eat lunch at 9 a.m. and 2 p.m. And there's only so much time within the school day and space within the building. So it's something to be mindful of. And then I did see in regard to cleaning, and I think maybe there's another section, but it just made me think when people were talking about cleaning needs, there was a public comment about cleaning the buses. So if the schools are going to have cleaning like this, what about cleaning the buses with similar frequency?
Those two protocols are coming up shortly. We have one for busing and transportation and one for cleaning.
Yep. And I think, Daphne, I'm going to write down here recommendation to consider alternative spaces to lunch to avoid those extreme lunch times. Mario, I'm not sure if your hand was up newly or from before. I just want to make sure we're checking in about the science piece if there's something else.
Yeah, I was just going to say, Megan, I've seen in some other places where they've taken these recommendations and say, we'll use alternative guidelines or alternative spaces as able to sort of allow schools some flexibility to say that they can't accommodate that. But I think it comes with the sort of acknowledged risk that you're putting more people into a space and that, that's not ideal. But I bring that up for the committee's consideration.
Thank you. Kristen, go ahead.
Thank you. I did have some concerns regarding additional responsibilities for staff, and what that looks like when communicating to staff at the local level. There are a number of things that are subject to mandatory bargaining that I don't know if these guidelines would supersede. So while we're putting in place these guidelines, I don't know what the conversation is going to look like at the local level, and how the different locals and each of the professionals within them will respond. So when we are compiling everything it is that we want to suggest that districts do, I have to then state again, clear directives and consistency across districts and across the state is going to be needed in order to get this done successfully. And then with that being said, these extra duties for different staff, I'm sure they understand the environment and are happy to help in any way that they can in order to keep themselves and their students safe. But there are certain employees that cannot and should not be pooled for some of these duties because it would take away from more important things that they could be doing. And I'm speaking with my specialists in mind. Oftentimes, counselors are pooled for school psychologists, school social workers are pooled for different duties like manning the front office, doing lunch duty, things like that. And while I understand it's all hands on deck, those types of employees, those types of professionals certainly could be doing more help with their students than being pulled away for kind of non-essential, or maybe they are essential, I shouldn't say non-essential, but these different types of tasks. So, Laura and other folks were nodding during, duty-free time. And again, it's like, okay, we put these guidelines out there in the world, but how do they, comply with what happens on the local level, especially with bargaining?
Thanks, Kristen. Those are good points. And I think, go back to some of the stuff we talked about with the mental health and making sure those professionals have their time to do the things they actually need to do. And so we can maybe go back and solidify those statements as well, which should help with some of that. Larissa, I think your hand is up next.
Yes, I mean, this comment can probably go with a number of them, but it's just bringing back to light the financial implications of the frequent cleaning, the increased products, and maybe we need more aids to support with lunches, whatever it looks like. That's just something that really needs to be on the table. I believe the American Association of Business did put out a suggested price model around how much this could cost for districts. So just something to look at and consider.
Thanks. Yeah, I think that we're hearing this again and again, coming back to this budget, and we're continuing to raise those concerns up to DOE and have some thoughts about them. Representative Smith, go ahead.
I'm good now. Thank you.
Okay. Emma, go ahead.
I forgot to unraise my hand, sorry.
No problem. Okay, thank you for all the comments around that. Mike, I will hand it over to you to talk about the athletic piece.
Right. So Paul, this again has 2 slides. If you could leave the first slide on there for a few seconds and then show the second slide, please. So I'm sure that the committee is aware that this is a hot topic. One of the areas that I oversee at DOE is DIAA. Your feedback in this particular area would be greatly appreciated in scenario 2. I'm sure the ADs, the coaches, the parents, and the athletes are probably chomping on the bit to get out on the field.
Stacy has her hand raised.
Hey,
And this is an area I've heard from a lot of folks about as well. And speaking of mental health, you know, athletics and mental health go hand in hand for a lot of students. There's a lot of students who are really, you know, depressed right now. They lost maybe their senior season of high school. They lost some time. You know, they have goals and ambitions, and not getting to do athletics is affecting their mental health. So if we can just consider that when making these decisions, I think it would be greatly appreciated by students and parents.
Stacey, could you help define that as a recommendation? What would that sound like?
It's really hard. I mean, in looking at the language, it's really hard to say, okay, we'll have golf and track and field, but we'll not have football and baseball. You know, just looking at the baseball recommendations right now that have come out, and the community response from that. I apologize for my crazy dog. You know, the guidelines of the umpire standing behind the pitcher and thinking about the, you know, even that safety aspect, but it's taking away from the sport, and there's a lot of concerns about that from students. I think they want to just play the game. I like the language of you know, making sure everybody's healthy before they participate, and you know, cleaning up the equipment and sterilizing everything. But this is an area where it just seems like we're in or we're out. Like it's really hard to put so many barriers in a sport or an athletic event and not fully play. So it's just, you know, from a mental health aspect, there are kids that they engage in school because they want to be athletically eligible. I mean, that's the carrot for them, is to play. They want to play, and that's the motivation for them to get through school. And so I hate to take that away from students. It's good for their physical health. It's good for their mental health. And I just think we should consider that when we're looking at athletics.
Mario, go ahead. I'm sure it's something about sort of the science and safety of this with health. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that I think, you know, in this interim period, while there's still a lot of research going on around what the risks are to athletics, a lot of places have actually just said we're going to defer on a formal recommendation on this and say we're going to see what the state Interscholastic Athletics Association says. That doesn't give a particular recommendation, and it sort of kicks the can down the road a little bit, but it does give some time for sort of more data and research to surface. You know, I think there's plenty of professional and college teams that have reported cases recently, but nobody really knows exactly what that means. So, you know, I bring that up for the committee's consideration. We can change language to say something to that effect, but it leaves a lot of ambiguity out for students and parents in the fall at this point.
Thanks, Mario. I would just like to also kind of throw out to the committee, you know, I think what we have to make the decision on is, do we want to be able to go back to school and go back to athletics, even if there are some of these things in place? So if we're saying health-wise, you know, like Mario was saying, we can hold on them, but there's still going to be rules. I think at the end of the day, it still becomes, what do we need in place from a health perspective to keep our kids safe? So just something to think about as we sort of move through this. Representative Smith, go ahead.
hey, yeah, I'm going to bring up kind of the same word as I did before, which is consistency. For some of these, when it comes to some of these kids, and you know, I'll just speak for myself too and others, but sometimes they're going to rely on the scholarship in order to even be able to afford college and go. So not affording them the opportunity to compete, that's a slippery slope to me. But also, if we can have other things with 50 or fewer people, I believe that they should be able to compete as long as it's 50 or fewer people, with them as the team, their coaches, and others. So I think that should be a consideration, respectfully. And when it comes to washing hands and doing all that, I definitely agree with all the cleaning standards. I would just say, I do know that some schools lock right afterwards and they don't have access to maybe that. So in the interim, maybe the teams have to provide sanitizer or something until they can get to something. But I just wanted to throw that out there.
Just so I make sure I'm clear as we're taking notes here, again, with the consistency piece, I know there's some state level recommendations on sports. Are you also suggesting that we sort of keep it in line with those?
I am from a standardization perspective, but for instance, if we are going to say no more than 50 people for a gathering, then in my mind, even if the state says something on that, we should give the children the opportunity to compete as long as it's
Thanks. I just wanted to make sure I got down what you said correctly.
Yep.
Dr. Fitzgerald, I think you're next. Dr. Fitzgerald, are you there? I think you're up next.
I'm sorry, Megan, I had muted myself again. So currently we're in scenario 2 in which there's the moderate risk. So if we were in scenario 1, we would anticipate that athletics would be permitted without any problem. In scenario 2, there are some concerns that would be taken, but when we talk about consistency, we also find that there are a lot of clubs and other groups that are currently having athletics outside of the school controlled environment. So when I hear consistency, I hear, well, you can do this in a different environment, but there may be restrictions that are placed on our students that don't allow them to do it in a school controlled environment. And I would have to echo what I've heard before, that athletics is an extremely important part of the school day for many children, whether it's an intramural activity or it's an activity in which there's varsity or junior varsity participation. I think that it's an important part of the whole student. So from the mental health aspect, I think that it's important to consider the needs of students. And it is a challenge as to whether or not you can say you can play a sport because we're deeming your sport not to be high contact, or that, whereas you can't participate in this other sport because there is a greater risk. I think in coming back to school, no matter what we say or do, there is always going to be some risk involved. So I think that those are things that we should consider before we say these sports are okay and these sports aren't. I think that we need to do a little bit more work and a little bit more research on that. Thank you.
So before we move forward again, just making sure that I'm getting this down as we're sort of thinking about it. You know, Mario asked the question, do we want our recommendation on athletics to be something like, we don't feel like we have enough information at this time for all sports. We want that recommendation to be made at a later date with some caveats such as that is consistent with state standards of gatherings. And I'm just putting that out there so to the group, it sounds like that's sort of what we're saying, but you know, that this is such an important thing. We want kids, if at all possible, to be able to go back. I think what Mario is also saying is right now, these are sort of the guidelines that have been laid out. So do we feel like we want to hold and push those back or not? Stacy, I'll your hand's up next. You can go ahead.
Thank you. Just from what Mr. Fitzgerald said, I agree. I think there's, I always go back to equity, and for, you know, students being able to do those club sports or play outside of the school area. Those are generally the kids who have access to the funds to do that. Whereas you know, other kids who don't have that access are going to play through school. So it comes back to an equity thing that I think we need to consider. And then I had another point and I completely forgot as far as the athletics, and I'm sorry, I apologize.
So quick question. So I've heard all the feedback. Are we saying that we disagree with the guidance in here in that we can have sports where we can social distance and that's okay? Or are we saying that we should allow all sports after we do some more homework, just for clarity, so as we go back and try to work on these tweaks to the guidance, I need to just make sure I understand clearly what everyone is saying. Dana, I don't know if you want to weigh in on some of the DPH guidelines, or even Mario in reference to why some sports would be allowable versus others, such as football. I don't know if that will have an impact, but I just want to have clarity so I know how to tweak this moving forward.
Yeah, Michael, I will just say, as a non-Delaware resident, I'm not sure it's my place to decide. My only recommendation as a physician is what, I think are risky activities, but I will defer to the folks on this committee about the recommendation to make.
Hey, this is Representative Smith. I agree. I think we need to, I think I agree with the point that we need to not allow the decision to be made now that certain sports can't and certain sports can. I think we have to be able to adapt with the coming months when school goes back and we're seeing where things are. But at the same time, we have to stay to the standards and the equity to make sure everyone else has the opportunity.
This is Reverend Powell. I had my hand up, but maybe didn't see it. But I probably would concur with Representative Smith. I wrestle with this protocol like we all wrestle with, but then I do understand why they call some sports non-contact and other sports contact sports. Those, and to someone from the outside would look at a non-contact sport and really feasibly say, well, how am I exposed more so than with someone playing a contact sport? So I don't know if I've had any clarity, but I just wanted to weigh in on the challenge. So I think we might want to consider, as he indicated, to just wait and see how this plays out moving down the road, bearing in mind that there are athletes that have to train throughout the summer to prepare for fall sports. So, I don't think that should discourage them from preparing just in case. So I just wanted to weigh in.
Thanks.
Thank you,
Senator
Rev.
Del Colo, I think Senator Del Colo also has a comment, Mike.
Thank you. So I think that this is a really valuable discussion. The only thing that I would caution is that whatever decision is made, it needs to have a level of non-arbitrary process with respect to the other recommendations that the state may make. So I don't believe that it can be the case from a global perspective for the state of Delaware to say that one thing's okay over here and another thing's not over there if the activities amount to the same sort of basic activity, where whether that be a lack of social distancing, lack of wearing a face mask in certain circumstances, or what have you. And the reason I say this is because, I've heard the examples, and I can't respond critically to these examples because there's certainly logic to them, saying that people can golf, but that a very, very large facility like some furniture outlets couldn't at the same time have appointments and aggressive cleaning and social distancing does not hold up to scrutiny from the view of the public or from the view of just basic common sense. So, there's a tension there. And that's just one example that was provided to me by a constituent. And I want to make sure that as we make these recommendations that we're viewing things in a global way and that we have a rational basis for what we're doing and recommendations throughout. And if that recommendation, understand that I'm not saying that we should or should not do sports. I defer to what the appropriate recommendations are from science and data. What I am saying is that we can't be seen to be arbitrary, because that will mean that everything that we do begins to devolve, and that would be very unproductive in terms of controlling a resurge and how we handle things throughout. So if we're exploring ways to effectuate some things that we view as important, then we have to explore ways to effectuate other things as well.
Thank you.
We have two more comments here. Dana, go ahead.
So this is Dana. I was going to basically say the same thing, which goes to some of the comments that I sent in, is that I think if we have some basic assumptions and some basic assertions that we know from science as of right now, and as it changes, we can update. I think that would really help center all of these recommendations in the basic science that we know and understand. So if we're talking about communicability and spread, close contact is, you know, a greater risk than not having contact. The other piece I just wanted to throw in there too is that this isn't just one season event that we need to be thinking through. We need to also be thinking forward into winter sports and into the spring as well. Winter, we're going to have a lot more indoor sports, and so we'll just need to make sure that when we put out any general recommendations, there's some considerations around those types of events and facilities as well. And I am a huge advocate for sports and physical activity, so maybe there's a way that we can also talk about ways to encourage physical activity during whatever the school day might look like, as well as some virtual opportunities to bring into that whole child piece as well. I think that would be a really positive thing to put in here. Instead of just telling people what they can't do, we can tell them some ideas about how they can keep kids active. And some of this will depend too on some of the other sports associations, and Dr. Fitzgerald, you can speak to this as well, like NCAA. And as this moves forward, I think this will be within a greater context of youth sports. So I don't know that Delaware will be making decisions that will be outside of sort of those groups as well. So I just wanted to throw those points out.
Thank you, Dana.
Dana, we have quite a few people waiting, Mike, just so you know, so I'll call their names, but if you just in the last 3 minutes sent in your name, just be patient with us. Dr. Santiago, go ahead.
Yes, hello to everybody. I just want you guys, we have to be very careful because we have to, looking at the kids, how are they, with our recommendations, how are they going to feel that you could play your sport, but I can't play mine? And so we got to be careful that what you can do this and you cannot do that. This is a very delicate situation for the mental health of the kids and everything. So we have to be very careful how we word that you could play this, but you can't play that. Because I know mentally and emotionally it's going to affect the kids. Thank you.
Thanks
so much.
Hey,
oh, sorry, go ahead.
Can I make a recommendation? Would it be possible, and I hate to cut anyone off, we have 20 minutes. We have a number of other protocols to go through. Would it be possible for the remaining hands that are up to please shoot us that feedback in the written form so that we could possibly get on to the next couple of protocols? And I greatly apologize, but we're making great progress tonight, great conversation, but if we could move on to the next protocol and please send us that info, we'll be sure to review it and integrate it into the protocol. That's okay.
Yep, I think Sue and Steve were the other two. So if you guys can send in your comments, that would be really helpful. Okay, we can go to the next slide, Paul, and there's two of these too. So these slides are the personal protective equipment and hygiene, which I know is also sort of a hot topic. I'm going to ask Mario if you can just give a quick overview of sort of the science on the masking, just so that we can know the most updated info, if that's okay.
Yeah, I think there's been a couple of studies over the last week that have come out. One most recently over the last weekend from the Proceedings of the National Academies, I think, that showed that globally, the action that seems like it's sort of stemmed spread the most was wearing masks, and they think it's about a 60% reduction. Certainly recognize the kind of political implications there. But I think from a scientific standpoint, what the paper showed was that it was actually like using masks and less of the actual like school closure or social distancing that seemed to help. So.
Thank you. I just wanted to make sure we have this updated, since folks are kind of talking tonight about what is the science we need to listen to and what is most updated. Larissa, you are first. Go ahead.
Yes, I understand that, and I like that you guys share that this is intended redundancy. I think just a clarifying point with the mask and the barrier screens, is it being recommended that both are in place, or that our school's going to be given the option of one or the other, just again, considering student behavior with the mask?
No, I think it was, these are the recommendations overall. So in theory, both, but I think we talked last time a bit about how it seems like a lot of, in terms of the science community, the barriers have less science to them in terms of prevention and how they're used in the mask.
Okay, great.
Folks can certainly give their thoughts there.
Great. So maybe if that's just clarified, just so schools kind of know that the emphasis is really on the mask and that the barriers could be another option, since both of the language right now puts them both on equal landing.
Thank you. I think next up is Senator Del Colo.
Thanks, Megan. I just, and this is for my edification, because I've seen this used from time to time, but I've seen some folks who have, rather than a mask, they all have almost like a clear face shield that goes, from the top of their head down to their neck area, and it's curved. Is there any information about that? Is that equivalent to or not as good as a mask? I've seen some people wearing both of them. It's just a general question for what's acceptable, what's not. I mean, I presume that somebody who maybe has a respiratory issue would be able to deal with that respiratory issue much more easily if they had a shield, because it's not directly up against their face. But these are just my assumptions. So out of curiosity, and because we're talking about face masks and PPE, what do we know about that?
I'm happy to share what I've read. I have not, Representative Del Colo, I haven't seen a sort of head-to-head comparison of what the reduction in spread is between face shields and face masks. But I think, to the point about barriers, I think people recognize that there's some value there. We just don't have a sort of comparative analysis to say.
Thanks, Mario. Senator Del Colo, is there any follow-up or any sort of change or thoughts about the recommendations given that answer?
So the only thing that I am thinking about with respect to the benefit of a face shield is that you can see facial expressions much easier with that. And there's an aspect to that as we interact with one another that I think is material. And it's probably also something that should be explored to see if there is some benefit for somebody who may have some indication if using a face shield versus a face mask would be more appropriate if they're having a tough time with their allergies or having a whatever. Like, there's probably some flexibility there for a variety of reasons. Like, if you want to do socially distant drama club, and one of the things is that you have to, act and have facial expressions, then that to me is something that might add some flexibility. So if there's any way to explore that, just to provide additional tools in the toolbox, it's something that I think is worth investigating.
So in terms of recommendations, because I'm trying to just be a little clear here.
So would it make sense to use that in lieu of a mask in some instances or not? And how does that all pan out? So that's my question. And that would then determine whether there would be a recommendation.
So what if, just to make sure I'm capturing what you're saying and make sure we get this right, my sort of thought is we could put in here a recommendation of face mask with the face shield as an alternative, as long as physicians, at that point, there's no new data that says they're not effective, something like that, or something like, compliant with current data.
Yeah, I think so. Because I could see instances where it would be much more comfortable for a person. And that might also offer some input from the perspective of our sports playing students and things like that. As we're looking for ways to effectuate some of those things, it doesn't necessarily need to be binary. Like, there can be different approaches that we use, and hearing about how a face covering is like the best tool in the toolbox, there are probably ways we can explore that and see, as the science develops, we should offer that as an option as long as it makes sense.
Thanks. I'll definitely note that. Dr. Santiago, go ahead.
Forgot to unraise my hand.
Oh, you didn't mean to raise your hand?
She forgot to unraise.
Oh, she forgot to unraise. Okay. We will move on to Dr. Fitzgerald.
Thank you, Megan. I certainly understand the science behind this, and I certainly support the science behind the face mask and understand it. But I think that this particular recommendation is almost impossible to enforce. I think that it puts schools and administrators and teachers in a very difficult position. We've heard, the challenges of perhaps a kindergarten student having a face mask. We hear about our special needs students who may not be able to wear face masks. And what recommendation will the committee make when a student at the middle school or high school level simply says, I'm not going to wear a face mask, or I don't want to do that? Is the recommendation going to come out that in some way, shape, or form there should be disciplinary action taken against that student for a refusal to wear a face mask? So it puts us in a very challenging position. We understand the science behind it, and we wish everybody would just naturally wear a face mask because it's in the best interest of everyone. But I'm always very hesitant anytime that we say that something should be a mandate or is a non-negotiable that is almost impossible to enforce without sending someone home, or without saying this shouldn't, that you can't be in school unless you have a face mask. So I caution the committee that we would have to make a recommendation like that if in fact we wanted to see that take place. And I think that's a very tough recommendation to make.
Thank you. I appreciate that perspective. Daphne, you're next.
Just a couple comments regarding the face shield. I would want to fall back on what some people mentioned earlier, using data and science. From what I have seen, and I'm not a medical professional, so I don't really have that kind of information, but what I have seen is the recommendation for tight-fitting face masks, and if there are gaps or it's hanging, it's not as effective because you're going to breathe in that air. So I just feel like I'd want to know in regard to the face shield that the bottom is like wide open. So it may protect from splatter or stuff coming directly at you, but you could still breathe in the air very easily without it being filtered at all. So just to get some, data from science on the effectiveness of those before we put that in the recommendations was one of my thoughts. And we certainly do have a lot of concern from parents about their kids' ability to wear a face mask, especially if they're going to be in school for 6 hours or all day, is difficult to do. And I don't know that there's an easy answer, because I also have parents that feel, if that's the best recommendation, what we're learning to protect against spread, if that's our number one goal is to keep everyone safe as possible, then we need to consider that too. So it's no easy task there.
That's exactly right. Thank you. We're going to do one last comment on this one. If you still have your hand raised, please send us the rest of your comments. We want to keep this moving. Sue Smith, you are the next one.
I just want to confer with I confer with Dr. Fitzgerald, because that's the biggest concern, are students wearing face masks. I know that the science says it gives a reduction and it helps to protect a child that may be asymptomatic from spreading with someone else. But the concern is teachers are going to spend most of their day getting Johnny to keep his mask on and not playing with it, and then they're going to be dirty. So it's an age level thing. Also, could we make the recommendation that they may wear them if they're coming on the bus, they wear them to school and home from school, and if they're in class, they can take it off and put it on their desk, or, just because it's going to be difficult for children to wear a mask all day in the school setting. The other thing is with a face shields are really recommended for droplet, for spitting, and those kinds of things, where it's not really protect you from airborne, because you can get airborne, breathing underneath of it. So you could breathe somebody that's next to you if you're not 6 feet apart. So the biggest concerns are masks for children. How are we going to keep them on them? How are we going to keep them clean? Wearing them all day long. And if there is a face shield, it's really recommended that they also wear a mask with it. So we would need to find out more about that. one would probably, a face shield would be better than nothing, but it's still the same thing. These are kids we're talking about and trying to get them to wear them all day. And I'm very pro wearing a mask, but I have great concerns about what's going to happen with, our teachers are going to spend all day worrying about kids wearing masks. And when a kid says, I'm not going to do it, what are we going to do? So could we have an option where if a parent wants their child to wear a mask, that would be fine. And we could do a recommended or if you want to, just some thoughts on that.
Thanks, Sue. I really appreciate that perspective. It's certainly, I think we appreciate the views of parents and families. Again, I think, as you're all saying, part of this depends on science, right? And if science at the end of the day says we can't send them back without that, the choice is, do we write something in like highly recommended or something? Please send the rest of your comments. I see a couple other coming up here. I'm going to hand this back over to Mike to talk about cleaning.
Okay. So the next section is cleaning. And Paul, this also is 2 slides. You could show the first one for a few seconds and then show the second one, please. So this slide is pretty straightforward. I do know that the concerns of manpower have come up, but what tweaks, anything we need to add in reference to this, take away, or change? Again, I don't know if there's any hands up.
Sorry, I was muted. Larissa.
I would like just a little clarity on what cleaning on an increased tempo means. So maybe just some suggestions in the parentheses, so schools have a little bit more of an idea of what that recommendation is.
So Mario, rather than guess, could you clarify what
Yep, I'm not sure who's not muted. But according to the CDC, it's every 2 to 3 hours. And I think that's the implied recommendation here. So it varies a little bit from playground equipment to indoor surfaces, but the way it's written, it's meant to sort of use the CDC guidelines as the standard.
Thanks, Mario.
So I would just recommend maybe putting that in there so school leaders know and the districts know as well.
Thank you.
Sue Smith, go ahead.
I just would like to make a recommendation that when districts, if we finalize this, that they put like times in for cleaning, like the playground equipment will be scheduled times for cleaning so that everybody in the building knows that such and such a time the playground equipment is going to be cleaned, or at this time this is going to be cleaned, kind of thing. And that was kind of the same, which I forgot to mention before, like with hand washing of the students, the teachers may need to put that in their planning time so that everybody washes their hands before they go to lunch, and it's supposed to be every 2 to 3 hours, so base it on those times, but schedule time so that people know when things are going to happen. So it's not like, oh, what time today? So
thank you, Sue.
Any other thoughts? I don't see any other hands up. I'll give it a minute to see, particularly around the cleaning piece. Senator Del Colo, go ahead.
Thanks. So one of the things that I've heard repeatedly about the issue of available cleaning solution and all of that. I mean, I know that I have a hard time finding it sometimes. I'm not sure if I'm looking in the wrong places, but I've tried to keep my family from contracting COVID, so we are cleaning much more frequently than we normally would probably. And I've heard the same thing from a number of small and medium-sized businesses, that getting this stuff has been a challenge. So I'm not sure what we would do in terms of a recommendation to reflect that fact. But it seems to me that making sure that there is an understanding of that and how we would effectuate it. I know we're supposed to concentrate on the what, but I guess as a legislator, my mind constantly goes to the how as well. And I just think that, similarly, if we're going to be concerned about face masks and face coverings and inability to address a mandate from a process standpoint, I think that the same thing can be said for this. Because if dealing with multiple business owners that have time and wherewithal to try to look for this stuff so that they can open to have their livelihood continue, then I have questions about how this occurs and making sure that we're prepared as a government to work with our districts in getting this type of thing done.
Senator, that's a great point. I think that's an area that the operations work group is probably working on. I'll be sure to share that with the co-chair Chuck so that they are aware of that concern and can address it. Absolutely.
I don't think there's any more hands, so we can go on to our next slide.
Great. We have about 4 minutes. The next slide is busing and transportation. It's one slide. Any thoughts, tweaks? My immediate thought as I read this was the feasibility of bullet one.
I'll also just add, as I was looking about this, one of the things that I think we don't mention here, whether or not we follow this exactly, but there's no mention of siblings, and a lot of our kiddos who ride buses together are siblings. So this says one student per seat. Certainly, many of our buses, have kids who are living in the same household. So that's one thing I see in here that we can certainly adjust. But I think for those of you working in the schools and getting kids on and off buses every day, your feedback on if this is actually feasible. Senator Zalcola, go ahead.
It just seems to me that, and we've spoken about the virtual learning component and the idea of hybrid scheduling and how to make that happen and when to recommend it. But it seems to me that if you have some sort of cycle, some people on, some people off schedule going, that this would really facilitate the idea of having buses at half capacity and staggering mixing of students and all that sort of thing. If you are recommending some sort of hybrid where people cycle in and cycle out, and if that's something to be explored during this phase of a potential pandemic resurge, then that to me would seem to dovetail with that pretty logically.
Thank you. Dr. Fitzgerald, go ahead. This is probably our last comment for the night. If folks feel strongly, we will get back to this next time. And if otherwise, you can certainly send in your comments. Go ahead, Dr. Fitzgerald.
I'm just concerned where we said a hard, fast should operate at half their normal capacity. We have certain buses that deal with our special needs children that go to our special schools that are not overly packed, and to say that they should operate at half their normal capacity would be a hardship on the families and on the transportation of those students. So I would simply say when feasible, or at least allow for an exception in certain cases in which school districts could ask for a waiver.
That's a great suggestion. Thank you. I see many more comments. I'm being cognizant that it's 6:29. For those of you who have your hands up, Kristen, Representative Smith, Stacy, Sue Smith, just briefly, anyone's thoughts on if you would like to continue this or send in your comments, or if we want to go back to the busing the very beginning of next meeting? Any opinions, thoughts on this? Okay. I'm going to say it's 6:30. I know we need to adjourn. For those of you still having comments about busing, please send them to us. And if there is something when we start next time, we made it almost all the way through this time. So thank you all so much. I think we got a lot done and have a lot of things that are solid recommendations to put in. Next week, we'll finish up with our medically vulnerable students and then move on to scenario 3. And Mike, I'll hand it back to you just to close up.
Again, I echo comments. Thank you so much for your engagement and all the feedback you provided us. Next meeting is next Tuesday, June 23rd from 5 to 6:30. We'll finish discussing the busing and the medically vulnerable and also scenario 3. With that, have a great evening, and I look forward to next week.